What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership at the fore. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the president of Russia. And it looks like that leadership role won't be changing hands anytime soon. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make the world work. We discuss everything from what we can expect from US shares for the coming year to what it takes to retrain as a mechanical engineer, and of course the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pericles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Paulamaria Blaxland-de Lange, co-founder of Pericles. Pericles provides supported housing, work, adult education and therapy for adults with complex needs. It is one of many organisations of its kind around the world which, although different, share an ethos and worldview. Paulamaria founded Pericles with her husband Simon in 1997 in response to an advertisement placed by West Sussex Social Services looking for housing opportunities within the community for people who had been living in mental health hospitals, many for extended periods of time. We discuss Pericles' history, success and future with Paulamaria now. Paulamaria, welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you very much for joining us today. And I think it would be a marvellous place to start. I know it's been some months since yourself at Pericles have been in the review. I think the listeners would love to know how you and the team at the organisation are and what you've been up to.
Well, we have been, I think, very interested in how things are developing, both in our relationship wider and our relationship to local authorities and the new social paradigms and the new rules, and the work itself is growing from strength to strength. The work with people is very, very good indeed, but the environment, of course, is ever changing.
Excellent, and I know there's a lot to touch on today, but I think, and for those that don't know, in fact, Paulamaria, of course, Pericles now founded over 2 decades ago, 1997, so which is an extraordinary amount of time now when you come to think about it, and it feels like yesterday. But what was some of the initial challenges, Paulamaria, that you encountered, and what was some of the key things that you learned that helped to shape the current success of Pericles?
Well, I think the first thing was that although we were asked to start by social services, the first big challenge was bureaucracy. On the one hand, very positive request that we should start, and on the other hand, bureaucracy, meaning that we didn't start for about a year, and to employ people for a year without income, that was quite a challenge. And then we had to go through a whole educational process, really with neighbours, to make sure that people understood, that people were welcomed, that the situation was good and safe in a neighbourly way. And the third one, of course, to find funding to purchase housing.
Of course.
So those are the main challenges then.
And I'm sure there's, no matter where you're on the country, what it is you do, that question of funding is always going to be a tricky one. But despite all of those things, you certainly did overcome an exceptionally well. And I think, you'll all know at Pericles more than anyone else about the importance of building and establishing, maintaining partnerships with the local community. And I know that's had some fantastic results for you there, and have seen some superb projects that have been born out of them.
Yes, I think so. I mean, after the original starting, we very soon became very visible. And of course, our adults with complex needs became very visible. And that was fairly new still, to bring people really out in the community. And that proved very, very positive, both with neighbors and with the wider community. And there were then places like local farms, local community farms, who were very lucky really to have those, and the local village shop closed down, and there were a lot of people in the village that really wanted to see something happening there, and so there was a very good environment really to start making partnerships, and they were always based on the perception of a need of one kind or another. You know, there were local needs, and there were human needs, and there were organizational needs, and we in some way could help with fulfilling those needs, and in return have our needs fulfilled as well.
And it's a fantastic way of putting it. And I know that some of the those projects that have been born out of it has been everything from a garden to a cafe. And how important is it, Paulamaria, in having resources like that give so many people you work with opportunities to experience things and practice things they may otherwise not be able to do?
Well, that's you put your finger on it, really. It is the most important, and that is that people, whoever they are, they want to help others. They want to do meaningful work. They want to be recognized that they have something to offer. They want to lead as much as possible a normal life. Many of the things that we take for granted, they can't take for granted because they need support with this, that, or the other. And I think the extraordinary thing is that in order to make it possible for people to be part of these very normal things, you actually can develop things and maintain things that otherwise would easily fall by the wayside. For instance, organic gardening, where really means you have to have people on the land doing the weeding rather than putting your pesticides on. And of course, that means that you can have people on the land working, and they benefit from being out in nature. They benefit from the routine. They benefit because they see, they do the work, and they see the things growing up, and then harvesting them, and then taking them down to our cafes so that they can be eaten, and they can go and eat with others. And so it really, all these activities really are community building, makes it possible for them to create friendships, to do meaningful work, and the same with the theatre company. We have people really who are artists in their own right, and it means that we can provide meaningful theatre, and for people really to see that people with complex needs are artists and can also really make meaningful theatre that works on social themes very visible in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
I know for those that don't know, in fact, Paulamaria, I know that the Pericles Theatre Company, which I think is celebrating its 21st anniversary this year, it's a great big part, and no doubt you're very proud of it, of what you do, because behind it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Paulamaria, but behind it it sums up, I think, some of your ethos there at Pericles, was that people can interact with one another through creative projects, and it produces such a positive effect on them as individuals.
Absolutely, and also that becomes visible. You know, that people make these relationships, and out of these relationships really can do something meaningful and full of fun and full of enjoyment and also full of discipline and full of learning, that is possible, and that they can relate to an audience in such a way that the audience go away gobsmacked, really to have a real experience. And it also means that if, for instance, like in the recent production, we're working on problems in the oceans, that we work with ecology, and we go to children and schools to perform, and it's quite extraordinary how with theatre you can make points in a way that is very acceptable and very real, and that's wonderful. Then people they do something that really has meaning, and where they are recognized. And that is, after all, we all want to be recognized, that our lives have meaning, that we can do something that is, that's really wanted and appreciated.
Absolutely. And to have that sense of self-worth really can't be emphasized enough.
No. It's like doing the crafts, for instance. We can buy things very cheaply now, and they look like something. But if you have something that's carefully made by hand, that's taken a long time to make with great care, that is wonderful. And also the crafts they've been shown to be of immense worth in terms of education and therapy. And for people to be able to have therapy on the one hand, and on the other hand, produce something that is beautiful and that can be sold and that people want, that is something that's really wonderful.
And on that point specifically, Paulamaria, I mean, the amount of research, scientific research that has occurred in the last 21 years or so, 22 years in neuroscience has been extraordinary. And it's important, I think, people realize that as well as the educational, but the therapeutic benefits of being able to make something with your own hands, especially in a social environment, is sometimes key for a lot of people.
It is absolutely, and we really need to make this much more widely available. There is so much scientific research now that shows that brain activity in healthy children that can run around and that make things and that can do artistic things together, that can do crafts, is immensely enhanced. And so we want healthy children that can think for themselves and that can really build healthy brains. That is really what we need to concentrate on, to really find out what a healthy way of life is really needed. And where there are people who have a problem with brain function of one kind or another, these crafts and these activities and these very physical activities also, together with the joy and the sense of achievement that go along with them, can really provide something that makes it very possible, much more possible, for people to lead a meaningful and normal as much as possible life.
Without a doubt. And it's something on that we could talk about for a lot longer, but I'm conscious we should move on a little bit. And if I can ask you, Paulamaria, especially with your experience in the sector, if we take a step back and look more broadly, what would you say, and this will be interesting to see how this compares with your earlier answer about how the challenges you faced yourselves when setting up the organisation. But as things stand now, especially in the medium term, the next 18 months or so, what are the major challenges, would you say, facing the sector?
Well, I think they're becoming very, very clear, really, and that is that because of the austerity cuts, because of the cuts everywhere, everything to do with social care has become very narrowly based. So I can have this conversation with you about how meaningful and how good it is and how people deserve to lead normal lives. But the fact is that many people, adults with complex needs, have had their budgets cut. And so everything that social workers used to do, which was really supporting individuals to create as much as possible a life that was meaningful and joyful and where they had choice, has now become much more of a tick box cash situation. And that is very, very difficult. It's also, on the other hand, the fact that relationships with people with complex needs, because of all the things that have been happening and in the press and so on, and safeguarding issues, have become very over-professionalized. And so when you have complex needs, and on one hand there's very little funding, and on the other hand the only relationships really that you have are professional ones, because everybody you relate to needs to have this and that training, and needs to have their DBS, and needs to have carry their official plastic thing around their neck to make sure that these are really bona fide people. It's understandable, but on the other hand, it means that it becomes very difficult for people to have a normal life, or to have real friendships, or to have a freedom of choice, because they're very, on both sides, these have become much more narrow than they used to be.
So if I'll put you on the spot here, Paulamaria, maybe this is a bit unfair, but let's you were made Secretary of State for the afternoon, and you had a magic wand, and you were able to reform something, introduce something, increase funding, which of course goes without saying. What would you do? What would be your priority in a way that you think would really help Pericles and organisations just like it up and down the country?
I think what would help is if we can look at people first and their needs. Because if you start looking only at finance, I know in my own experience that if I start worrying about finance, rather than just really use my common sense and see what's in front of me as a need, then in the end, I create myself a situation that's far more difficult and expensive in the end. So you begin to make very short-term decisions. And that is a problem. The other problem that I can see is that we need to get away of a power-based political system, but create a political system where people really are administrators of money that, after all, belongs to people, because they are working. The people who work, they create an income, and some of that income is given to a government that administrates that on behalf of all in as fair and as good and as responsible a way as is possible. But if a lot of that money is used in order to have power fights, then there isn't going to be any money available that really, by rights, should belong to people who do the work to provide that income. And so, I would say more people-based and more longer-term based. We now have a situation where there are many, many complex needs people who are in prison, and they didn't need to be there. I know that they didn't need to be there. If you don't support someone with complex needs, then they become very, very vulnerable. And they need help and support so that they can give of their best, so that they can have the support where they can't do things, rather than to be left to have to do things that they can't do, which then go wrong. And so we are left with, with lots of people in hospitals, lots of people in very difficult situations, homeless situations, prisons, that really don't need to be there, and it's much more expensive.
And I think
it's much more expensive to pay for somebody to be in prison than for them to be with Pericles.
And I think you've hit on some really key points there, Paulamaria, and maybe it does come down to, and thank goodness, things really have only gotten better on this front in very strong ways sometimes over the last few decades, but changing perceptions regarding those with learning difficulties and other problems. And it's up. The point being, it's very much up, I think, for the rest of society, with education for them to understand how it is best for those people with any problems to be able to interact with everybody else in a much more comprehensive way. And let's only hope it gets better, but it must start with education. What would you say, though, Paulamaria, are some of the best ways for the wider public's perceptions to be changed on that front?
Oh, I think we need hundreds and hundreds of Pericles everywhere.
Absolutely.
And they don't need to be Pericles, but organizations like it. Where we have a cafe where people learn and where they interact with the public, where we have a theatre company where people are on the stage and can entertain and at the same time make jolly good points and even make people cry because they are moved and because they become aware of things they wouldn't otherwise have been aware of, where we can again get people onto the land, where we can get people to make craft and to give it the time it needs to create something beautiful, to really work with materials so that some of these crafts, which are ancient crafts, which England is famous for, don't all disappear. You look at the John Ruskin, for instance. He learned crafts because he said, if I don't learn this and pass it on and write a book about it, these crafts will be lost.
Absolutely.
And so that is really what I see. Just common sense. And for people to meet one another without this judgment of what you are worth in financial terms. That to me lies really at the bottom of everything.
And I don't think anyone else could have summed it up as well as that. And I'm conscious of the time here. We'll have to wrap things up very shortly. But if I can, perhaps if I can ask you to answer this in a few sentences, as you look to the future, not just for Pericles, but for everyone working in the sector, and indeed everybody you've ever worked with, what do you view, I think, as some of perhaps the more positive things to be looking out for as we go forward?
I think common sense and really giving people who do the work a voice as to what is needed, rather than think in terms of finance first and foremost. The other thing that I would say is we desperately need to have a good relationship and continue to have a good relationship with Europe, where many things are developed in different ways. I represent in Europe, so I go to many different places. There's so much that we can learn from one another and have learned from one another over these last decades. And we need to continue that too. Also, we need to now look wider afield. Well, and I think that's what I think is the most important for me to go into the future.
Paulamaria, I think in the words of John Ruskin, there is no wealth but life. And on that point, I think, thank you very much for joining us today. And hopefully we can speak again very soon.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Paulamaria, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Pericles are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pericles. Lord Pericles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pericles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Lord Pericles, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. indeed before the days we were in the common market. But of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well,
I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
No, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow chairman, Lord Blunkett, has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxist to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I had Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder visitors, and they always used to kind of, you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bump was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road, Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site, which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress, since of course you're stepped down being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, because you're the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and war-bane. Yeah, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I meant to make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
Very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well. It's so important, especially at this time of history, after so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Anstaltgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to.
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it will be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it will be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pericles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the feathers to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pericles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.